Imagine you're a German officer in the closing months of World War II. Your army is retreating. Your air force barely flies. Your tanks sit silent not because they've been destroyed, but because they have nothing left to burn. Now imagine discovering enough American gasoline to fill an entire battalion's vehicles. More than 50,000 gallons of fuel. For a brief moment it feels like a miracle. But then comes a chilling realization. Even this incredible prize cannot save Germany. Because by the time that fuel is captured, the Third Reich is already dying. This is the remarkable story of a German colonel, an unexpected American fuel depot, and the moment one battlefield victory revealed the inevitable collapse of Nazi Germany. To understand why this discovery mattered so much, we have to travel back to late 1944. By then, the war had changed completely. Only a few years earlier, Germany seemed unstoppable. Its armored divisions had raced across Europe with breathtaking speed. Poland fell in weeks. France collapsed in just over a month. The German military had perfected a style of warfare the world would come to know as blitzkrieg. Fast-moving tanks, mechanized infantry, dive bombers, constant momentum. But there was one ingredient that made blitzkrieg possible: fuel. Without gasoline and diesel, the famous German panzer divisions became nothing more than steel monuments sitting in muddy fields. Every Tiger tank consumed enormous amounts of fuel. Even smaller Panzer IVs required constant resupply. Trucks carrying food, medical equipment, ammunition. Everything depended on fuel. The German army wasn't simply fighting its enemies. It was fighting against mathematics. Every mile advanced meant more gasoline burned. Every battle required thousands of gallons. Every retreat demanded even more. As the war expanded, Germany's fuel problem became impossible to ignore. Unlike the United States, Germany possessed very limited domestic oil reserves. Instead, Hitler depended on imported oil and synthetic fuel plants. Romania's Ploiești oil fields became one of Germany's most valuable resources. The Allies understood this perfectly. American and British bombers repeatedly attacked oil refineries, storage facilities, and transportation networks. Each bombing raid made Germany's fuel shortages worse. Then came another devastating blow. The Soviet Union advanced into Eastern Europe. Eventually, Germany lost access to many of its remaining oil supplies. At the same time, Allied bombers destroyed synthetic fuel factories inside Germany itself. Production collapsed. The numbers became frightening. By late 1944, German aviation fuel production had fallen dramatically. Many Luftwaffe pilots received little flying practice because there simply wasn't enough gasoline. Entire squadrons remained grounded. Experienced pilots watched from airfields as Allied bombers flew overhead almost unchallenged. The German army faced the same crisis. Tank commanders often received orders limiting movement. Training exercises were cancelled. Convoys stood motionless for days. Some armored units possessed powerful tanks, but not enough fuel to move them. Imagine owning one of the most feared tanks in history, yet being unable to drive it even 10 miles. That became reality for countless German crews. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, the United States faced the exact opposite problem. America had become the industrial giant of the Allied war effort. Its factories operated around the clock. Oil flowed from Texas, Oklahoma, California, and countless other fields. American refineries produced staggering amounts of gasoline. The United States didn't simply supply itself. It fueled Britain. It fueled the Soviet Union through Lend-Lease. It fueled fleets crossing the Pacific. It fueled armies marching across Europe. American logistics became one of history's greatest military achievements. Behind every frontline soldier stood an enormous supply system. Tankers crossed the Atlantic carrying millions of gallons. Pipelines stretched across liberated France. Truck convoys drove day and night. One famous supply network became known as the Red Ball Express. Thousands of mostly African-American drivers risked exhaustion and enemy attack to deliver gasoline, ammunition, and food to rapidly advancing Allied forces after the Normandy invasion. Without them, the Allied advance might have stalled. Fuel wasn't glamorous. It rarely appeared in dramatic battlefield photographs. But every famous Allied victory depended upon it. General George Patton understood this better than almost anyone. His aggressive armored offensives demanded incredible quantities of gasoline. Patton reportedly joked that his tanks could continue fighting as long as someone kept filling them. The joke carried a serious truth. Modern warfare had become a contest of logistics. Whoever kept vehicles moving usually held the advantage. As Allied armies raced across France during the summer of 1944, They advanced faster than planners expected. Sometimes fuel depots struggled to keep pace. Temporary storage sites appeared throughout liberated territory. Tank trucks lined country roads. Fuel drums stacked higher than houses waited for transport to the front. Most remained safely behind Allied lines. But war is unpredictable. Front lines change. Roads become blocked. Communications fail. Units become isolated. Occasionally, enormous stockpiles found themselves surprisingly close to advancing German forces. One such cache would soon become legendary. By the winter of 1944, Hitler prepared one final gamble. He believed a massive surprise offensive through the Ardennes forest could split the British and American armies. The operation became known as the Battle of the Bulge. The plan relied on speed. German armored columns would punch through weak American defenses. They would capture bridges before Allied engineers destroyed them. Then they would race toward the Belgian port of Antwerp. If successful, Hitler hoped political disagreements among the Western Allies might force negotiations. It was an incredibly risky plan. And once again, if American soldiers destroyed those supplies before retreating, the German offensive could literally run out of gas. That is exactly why one German colonel suddenly found himself standing before an unbelievable prize. Thousands upon thousands of gallons of perfectly usable American gasoline. Enough to keep armored vehicles moving. Enough to extend an offensive. Enough to give exhausted German soldiers a burst of hope. But what happened next would expose a brutal reality. Because fuel alone could no longer change the outcome of the war. Germany had reached the point where even its greatest logistical victory could not overcome the crushing weight of Allied industrial power, overwhelming manpower, and complete control of the skies. The colonel looked across the captured fuel with mixed emotions. His men celebrated. Drivers smiled. Tank crews imagined engines roaring back to life. Yet experienced officers understood something deeper. If Germany had reached the stage where its survival depended on stealing American gasoline, then perhaps the war had already been lost. And soon, events on the battlefield would prove just how right that terrible realization was. Chapter 2, The German Colonel's Greatest Prize. December 1944. The forests of the Ardennes were cold, dark, and covered in snow. 4 days, German forces had pushed through surprised American positions, creating the massive bulge in the Allied front line that would give the battle its famous name. At first, it seemed Hitler's gamble might actually work. American units were scattered. Roads became clogged with retreating vehicles. Entire towns changed hands within hours. German soldiers, exhausted after months of defensive fighting, suddenly found themselves advancing again. But beneath this apparent success lay a dangerous truth. The offensive was running on borrowed time. Every tank that rolled forward burned precious gallons of gasoline. Every supply truck emptied another fuel tank. Every mile toward the Meuse River reduced Germany's chances of continuing the attack. German commanders watched their fuel gauges almost as carefully as they watched the enemy. Many crews carried only enough fuel for one more day's fighting. Some armored vehicles were already being abandoned, not because they had been knocked out by American artillery, but because they had simply run dry. One German tanker later recalled that fuel had become more valuable than ammunition. A tank without shells could still move. A tank without fuel became useless. That was why orders from higher headquarters were unmistakable. Whenever possible, capture Allied fuel intact. Protect it. Use it immediately. Among the officers responsible for carrying out these orders was a German colonel commanding an armored formation pushing deep into American-held territory. Like every experienced commander, he understood that logistics, not courage alone, decided campaigns. His soldiers had fought brilliantly. But bravery could not make an empty fuel tank run. As German columns advanced through Belgian villages and narrow forest roads, they encountered abandoned American supply areas. Some contained ammunition. Others held food. Occasionally they found medical equipment. But then came the discovery every German officer dreamed of. A large American fuel depot. Thousands of containers, tank trucks, storage drums. Fuel waiting to be delivered to advancing U.S. forces. Instead, it had fallen into German hands. The amount was staggering. Roughly 50,000 gallons of gasoline. Enough to keep dozens of armored vehicles moving. Enough to extend operations that otherwise might have stopped within hours. German soldiers reportedly reacted with excitement. After weeks of constant shortages, the sight seemed almost unbelievable. Some joked that they had discovered liquid gold. Drivers rushed to refuel trucks that had nearly stalled. Mechanics worked frantically, filling every available vehicle. Officers quickly organized security around the captured depot. No one wanted American aircraft, or American artillery, to destroy such a priceless prize. For a brief moment, morale soared. Perhaps fortune had finally smiled on Germany. Perhaps this unexpected windfall would allow the offensive to continue. Perhaps the road to Antwerp remained open. But experienced officers saw a larger picture. 50,000 gallons sounded enormous, and in civilian life it certainly was. Yet modern mechanized warfare consumed fuel at an astonishing rate. A single Tiger tank could burn several gallons every mile, especially in rough terrain. Panther tanks, half-tracks, armored cars, trucks, and staff vehicles all demanded constant refueling. An armored division could consume tens of thousands of gallons in a very short period. What looked like a mountain of gasoline could disappear with frightening speed. The colonel understood the mathematics. The captured fuel wasn't a permanent solution. It was a temporary extension of life. Like giving water to a traveler crossing an endless desert. It delayed disaster. It didn't prevent it. Meanwhile, American commanders reacted quickly. Although the German attack had achieved surprise, Allied logistics remained remarkably flexible. New supply routes were established. Additional fuel depots were moved farther from the front. Engineers repaired damaged roads. The famous Red Ball Express system had already demonstrated America's ability to adapt under pressure, and countless logistics officers now worked around the clock to keep fuel flowing toward combat units. Most importantly, the Allies possessed something Germany no longer had: an almost limitless reserve. If one depot was captured, another could replace it. If several truck convoys were destroyed, more trucks arrived. American industry continued producing gasoline in quantities Germany could scarcely imagine. The captured fuel represented a painful loss, but it wasn't catastrophic. For Germany, however, the situation was entirely different. That one captured depot mattered because there were so few alternatives. Every gallon counted. Every drum mattered. Every successful seizure became front-page news inside German headquarters. That difference revealed just how uneven the war had become. One side worried about replacing a shipment. The other worried about survival. As German armored units pushed westward, reality became increasingly harsh. Roads jammed with vehicles. Traffic slowed to a crawl. Destroyed bridges forced long detours. American engineers demolished crossings before German tanks could seize them. Every detour meant more fuel burned. Snow and mud increased consumption even further. Vehicles idled for hours while waiting for traffic to move. Engines drank gasoline even while standing still. Then came another deadly enemy. The weather began to clear. For several days, thick clouds had protected German forces from Allied aircraft. But once the skies opened, everything changed. American and British fighter bombers filled the air. They hunted German convoys relentlessly. Fuel trucks became prime targets. Columns moving during daylight risked devastating attacks from above. Even if the Germans captured thousands of gallons of gasoline, transporting it safely became another challenge entirely. Tankers exploded. Roads became littered with burning wreckage. Drivers abandoned vehicles under constant air attack. The colonel watched as the offensive slowed. Not because his soldiers lacked determination. Not because they lacked skill. But because the enemy controlled the skies. Without air superiority, logistics became a nightmare. Every mile forward demanded extraordinary effort. Every gallon delivered to the front required immense risk. The captured American fuel helped, but only briefly. Soon tanks needed refilling again. Trucks returned with empty tanks. The same desperate calculations resumed. How far could they go? Which vehicles deserved priority? Should commanders fuel tanks? Or trucks carrying ammunition? Should ambulances receive gasoline? Or reconnaissance vehicles? These impossible decisions became daily life. Then intelligence reports began arriving. American reinforcements were pouring into the battlefield. Fresh infantry divisions. Additional armored units. Massive artillery concentrations. Even as German commanders struggled over captured fuel, the Allies continued building overwhelming strength. The colonel reportedly recognized the significance almost immediately. He had won a remarkable logistical victory. Yet the strategic picture remained unchanged. Germany had captured fuel. America continued producing it by the millions of gallons. Germany celebrated one depot. The United States operated an entire industrial continent. This was no longer simply a battle between soldiers. It was a battle between economies, factories, railroads, oil fields, shipyards, steel mills. And in that contest, Germany could no longer compete. The colonel stood beside the captured fuel, knowing it would keep his vehicles moving for a little longer. But deep inside, he understood something that many political leaders in Berlin refused to admit. A nation that must depend on its enemy's gasoline has already reached the edge of defeat. The offensive continued. Fighting remained fierce. Lives were still being lost by the thousands. Yet beneath every tactical decision lay one unavoidable truth. Time was running out. And no amount of captured fuel could refill the empty reserves of an empire already collapsing from within. The greatest prize of the campaign had become something else entirely. Not a victory, but a warning. A warning that Germany's final gamble was consuming its last remaining strength. And before long, the battlefield itself would confirm what that German colonel had already begun to suspect. The war was no longer about whether Germany could advance. It was about how much longer Germany could endure. Chapter 3, 50,000 gallons, and a terrible realization. For a few precious days, the captured American gasoline did exactly what German commanders had hoped. Engines that had been silent roared back to life. Panzer crews climbed into their vehicles with renewed confidence. Supply trucks rolled west once again. Mechanics worked non-stop, topping off every tank they could. To the ordinary soldier, it felt as if fate had handed Germany one last chance. But wars are rarely decided by a single lucky discovery. They are decided by momentum. And by late December 1944, that momentum had already shifted beyond Germany's control. The German colonel watched his columns continue their advance. At first, reports from the front sounded encouraging. American resistance had been broken in several sectors. Small towns changed hands. Road junctions were captured. Some U.S. units withdrew in confusion after the surprise attack. It looked remarkably similar to the lightning campaigns Germany had launched earlier in the war. Yet there was one crucial difference. In 1940, the Germans had been advancing against an enemy that struggled to respond quickly. In 1944, they faced an opponent with unmatched industrial power, flexible logistics, and overwhelming reserves. Every American unit forced to retreat was soon replaced by another. Every destroyed vehicle could be replaced. Every damaged bridge was repaired. Every setback triggered an even larger response. The Germans, meanwhile, had no such luxury. Every lost tank weakened the offensive. Every experienced crew killed could never truly be replaced. Every gallon of fuel burned was 1 gallon gone forever. Then came the weather change that German commanders had dreaded. The thick winter clouds finally broke apart. Blue sky appeared over Belgium. To civilians it may have looked beautiful. To German soldiers it was terrifying. Within hours, Allied aircraft filled the skies. American P-47 Thunderbolts swept across the battlefield. British Typhoons hunted moving columns. Medium bombers struck supply routes. Reconnaissance aircraft photographed every German movement. The roads that had been crowded with advancing armor suddenly became death traps. A fuel truck was no longer just a truck. It became one of the most valuable and vulnerable targets on the battlefield. Pilots knew exactly what to look for. Destroy the fuel, and the tanks would stop. The colonel now faced a cruel irony. He had captured thousands of gallons of gasoline. But transporting that fuel safely to the units that needed it became increasingly difficult. Convoys could move only at night. Drivers traveled without headlights whenever possible. One mistake, one aircraft overhead, and entire shipments disappeared in towering fireballs. Witnesses described burning fuel trucks sending thick black smoke hundreds of feet into the air. Some explosions were visible for miles. The psychological effect was devastating. Every destroyed convoy represented days of planning erased in seconds. Meanwhile, the Americans continued strengthening their defenses. Perhaps the most famous stand occurred around the Belgian town of Bastogne. There, surrounded American troops refused repeated German demands to surrender. Instead, they held their ground despite freezing temperatures, limited supplies, and constant shelling. Their resistance disrupted German timetables at exactly the moment when speed mattered most. Every hour spent fighting at Bastogne meant more fuel consumed, more ammunition fired, more opportunities for Allied reinforcements to arrive. The German offensive had been designed like a sprint. Instead, it became a marathon. And Germany simply didn't have the resources to finish the race. The colonel began noticing troubling signs. Tank crews started asking about additional fuel deliveries. Truck drivers requested priority refueling. Staff officers argued over allocations. Some units received only part of what they requested. Others received nothing. The captured American gasoline had bought valuable time. But it could not create an endless supply. Eventually, the reserve began shrinking. Every map table discussion returned to the same question. How much fuel remains? Not. How many tanks remain? Not. How much ammunition remains? Fuel had become the center of every operational decision. Without it, nothing else mattered. The Germans also faced another problem that no captured depot could solve. Mechanical wear. Many vehicles had already fought for years. Engines were worn. Transmissions failed. Tracks snapped. Replacement parts became increasingly scarce. A tank with a full fuel tank was still useless if its engine had broken down. German maintenance crews performed miracles with limited tools. They cannibalized damaged vehicles, improvised repairs, worked through freezing nights. But even the best mechanics couldn't overcome the lack of spare parts. Across the front, abandoned German vehicles became an increasingly common sight. Some had run out of gasoline. Others had broken down. Some simply couldn't be recovered after minor damage because there were no towing vehicles left. The colonel understood that every abandoned machine represented months of factory labor, and an investment Germany could no longer afford to lose. At the same time, Hitler continued demanding impossible results. Orders from Berlin insisted the offensive must continue. Objectives remained unchanged. Antwerp was still the goal. Reality on the ground, however, painted a different picture. Commanders knew they were falling behind schedule. The breakthrough had slowed. American resistance had stiffened. Fuel consumption exceeded expectations. Allied aircraft dominated the skies. The offensive was losing momentum with every passing day. Then intelligence reports brought even worse news. The Soviet Red Army was preparing a massive offensive in the east. Germany now faced an impossible strategic dilemma. Every division committed in Belgium weakened defenses against the Soviets. Every gallon burned in the Ardennes was fuel unavailable elsewhere. Even if the Western offensive somehow succeeded, another disaster loomed on Germany's eastern frontier. The colonel reportedly began discussing the broader situation with fellow officers. Many had served together since the early years of the war. They remembered Poland, France, the Balkans, the opening stages of the invasion of the Soviet Union. Back then, Germany had always seemed to possess the initiative. Now, they reacted instead of dictated. They hoped instead of planned. They searched for enemy fuel instead of relying on their own. It was a profound psychological shift. Some officers still believed victory remained possible through determination alone. Others quietly accepted the truth. Germany's military remained dangerous. Its soldiers still fought skillfully. Its commanders remained capable. But no army, regardless of courage, could overcome overwhelming shortages forever. The captured fuel depot had become a symbol. At first it symbolized hope. Now it symbolized desperation. Think about what that moment truly meant. One of the world's most powerful armies had launched its final major offensive, counting on stealing its enemy's gasoline to keep moving. That wasn't confidence. That was necessity. And necessity is rarely the foundation of lasting victory. The colonel reportedly looked over maps one evening, tracing the distance still separating his forces from their objectives. The miles ahead seemed impossible. Not because his soldiers lacked bravery, but because every mile required fuel, every bridge required engineers, every village demanded supplies, every delay strengthened the enemy. The arithmetic no longer worked. Then came the realization that would stay with many German officers for the rest of their lives. Even if they captured another fuel depot, and another, and another, it still wouldn't change the balance of the war. America would simply produce more. Britain would keep supplying troops. The Soviet Union would continue advancing from the east. Germany wasn't losing because of one failed battle. Germany was losing because its enemies possessed greater resources, greater production, and greater staying power. The Battle of the Bulge had become the Third Reich's final gamble. The captured 50,000 gallons had briefly delayed reality. But reality always catches up. And soon it would arrive with overwhelming force. The colonel had achieved one of the most remarkable logistical captures of the campaign. Yet standing beside those fuel drums, he understood something that many in Berlin still refused to face. The greatest shortage confronting Germany wasn't gasoline. It was time. Chapter 4. Why Germany was already doomed. By January 1945, the illusion was over. The Battle of the Bulge had failed. The German offensive that was supposed to split the Allied armies and force a negotiated peace had instead become the Third Reich's last major defeat in the West. The captured American fuel had delayed the inevitable. It had kept engines running. It had allowed tanks to travel a little farther. It had given exhausted soldiers a brief moment of hope. But it could not change history. One by one, German units were forced back toward the borders of their own country. Many tanks that had crossed into Belgium never returned. Others were abandoned beside frozen roads after running out of fuel or suffering mechanical failures. Entire convoys became twisted wrecks under relentless Allied air attacks. The roads that had once carried Germany's advance were now filled with retreating columns. For the German colonel, the truth had become impossible to ignore. He had witnessed one of the greatest logistical prizes of the campaign. Yet even that extraordinary success had failed to produce strategic victory. Why? Because World War II was no longer being decided by battlefield brilliance alone. It was being decided by production, by economics, by logistics, by the ability to replace losses faster than the enemy could inflict them. And in every one of those categories, Germany had fallen hopelessly behind. Consider the numbers. By 1944, American factories were producing aircraft at astonishing rates. New bombers rolled off assembly lines almost every hour. Thousands of Sherman tanks were manufactured. Millions of artillery shells were shipped overseas. The United States produced so much fuel that entire fleets, armies, and air forces could operate simultaneously across multiple continents. Meanwhile, Germany struggled to replace equipment lost in a single campaign. Every destroyed Panther tank represented weeks of manufacturing. Every experienced crew member lost in battle represented years of training that could never truly be replaced. The imbalance grew larger every month. The Allies also controlled the seas. Convoys crossed the Atlantic carrying endless supplies. Food, medicine, fuel, vehicles, ammunition, fresh soldiers. Germany, by contrast, faced blockades, bombing campaigns, and collapsing transportation networks. Railroads were repeatedly destroyed by Allied aircraft. Bridges disappeared under precision bombing. Factories shut down after devastating air raids. Even when Germany produced weapons, getting them to the front became increasingly difficult. Fuel shortages affected trains. Truck shortages slowed deliveries. Air superiority belonged almost entirely to the Allies. The German colonel understood these realities because he lived them every day. A captured fuel depot could help one formation. It could not repair bombed railroads across Germany. It could not rebuild destroyed refineries. It could not stop thousands of Allied bombers from attacking industrial centers. It could not replace experienced pilots killed months earlier. It could not reverse years of strategic decline. Then came the East. While German forces struggled in Belgium, the Soviet Union prepared one of the largest offensives of the entire war. In January 1945, the Red Army launched the Vistula-Oder offensive. The results were catastrophic for Germany. Soviet forces advanced hundreds of miles in just weeks. Entire German armies collapsed. Cities fell one after another. The Eastern Front consumed divisions that Germany desperately needed elsewhere. Every reserve committed to the Ardennes offensive was now unavailable to stop the Soviet advance. The nightmare German planners had feared was becoming reality. Germany was being crushed from both directions. American, British, Canadian, and French forces advanced from the west. Soviet armies surged from the east. There was nowhere left to maneuver. No hidden reserve waiting to save the Reich. Only shrinking territory and mounting casualties. Inside Germany itself, ordinary civilians felt the collapse. Air raid sirens became part of daily life. Entire neighborhoods disappeared beneath bombing raids. Electricity failed. Food became scarce. Transportation systems broke down. Refugees fled westward as Soviet forces approached. Factories worked under impossible conditions, often with damaged machinery and constant interruptions from Allied bombers. The war had reached German homes. For many officers, including the colonel who had captured the American fuel, the emotional burden became almost unbearable. They had spent years believing Germany's military machine was unstoppable. Now they watched it slowly unravel. Not because their soldiers suddenly lacked courage. German units continued fighting fiercely until the final months of the war. Many battles remained incredibly costly for the Allies. But courage cannot manufacture gasoline. Bravery cannot replace destroyed factories. Discipline cannot create oil fields. Modern war rewards preparation as much as heroism. The Allies had mastered both. Even Hitler's closest commanders began recognizing the hopelessness of the situation. Some argued for withdrawal. Others suggested negotiations. Several believed Germany should preserve what remained of its army rather than sacrifice it in impossible offensives. Hitler rejected those arguments. He demanded resistance to the very end. Orders became increasingly detached from battlefield reality. Units were instructed to hold positions that could not be defended. Counterattacks were launched without adequate fuel or ammunition. Experienced officers found themselves carrying out missions they knew could not succeed. The gap between political leadership and military reality widened every day. The captured 50,000 gallons of American gasoline became one of countless examples of that disconnect. On paper, it looked like an impressive victory. And tactically, it was. Any army would celebrate seizing such a valuable resource. But strategy is different from tactics. A tactical success wins a battle. Strategic strength wins wars. Germany still possessed capable commanders. It still fielded dangerous weapons. Its Tiger and Panther tanks remained feared by Allied crews. Its soldiers often fought with extraordinary determination. Yet those strengths could no longer compensate for overwhelming material disadvantages. The colonel's realization that Germany was doomed despite capturing enormous amounts of fuel perfectly illustrates this reality. He wasn't witnessing the failure of one operation. He was witnessing the collapse of an entire war effort. By the spring of 1945, Allied forces crossed the Rhine. The last natural barrier protecting Western Germany had been breached. Soon afterward, Soviet troops reached the outskirts of Berlin. The capital became the final battlefield. Street by street, building by building, the Third Reich collapsed. On April 30, 1945, Adolf Hitler died in his underground bunker beneath Berlin. Less than 2 weeks later, on May 8, Germany officially surrendered. The war in Europe was over. Looking back today, historians often focus on famous battles, legendary generals, and revolutionary weapons. But sometimes history is explained by something far simpler: fuel. A single captured depot containing 50,000 gallons of American gasoline tells the story of World War II better than many battles. It reveals how completely logistics determined the outcome of modern warfare. The Germans fought with skill. The Allies fought with skill, and possessed overwhelming industrial power. In the end, that difference proved decisive. The colonel had captured exactly what his army needed most. Yet in doing so, he also discovered the harshest truth of the entire war. If Germany's greatest hope depended on using American fuel, then Germany no longer possessed the resources needed to win. That realization was more powerful than any battlefield report, because it exposed a reality that no propaganda could hide. The Third Reich was no longer fighting for victory. It was fighting to delay defeat. And no amount of captured gasoline could keep that engine running forever. The story of those 50,000 gallons is not simply about fuel. It is about the limits of military brilliance when confronted by overwhelming economic power. It is about the unseen logistics that determine the fate of nations. And above all, it is a reminder that in modern war, battles may be won by soldiers. But wars are ultimately won by the nations capable of sustaining them. That German colonel's greatest battlefield prize became, in the end, the clearest evidence that Germany's defeat was no longer a possibility. It was only a matter of time.